I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it.
Prince William entered the grand, historic chamber carrying the heavy weight of centuries on his shoulders. But he walked out with something far heavier and deeply painful: public humiliation. The High Court's cold and historic ruling did not completely remove his ancient title, but it permanently shattered his personal control over it in a way no one saw coming. In one cold, calculated legal sentence, the future king discovered that the name he wore like a shining shield was not truly his command. Everyone inside that packed room knew the monarchy had just changed forever. Before we go any deeper into what this shocking verdict really means for the future of the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. William did not move an inch when the judgment was read out loud by the senior judge. His hand tightened against the wooden armrest. Slow at first, then hard enough to show the immense strain he was fighting so desperately to hide from the world. Catherine saw it before anyone else did. She saw his face change, not with open anger, but with the stunned, heartbreaking silence of a man who had just been told that the power he believed belonged to him had always belonged somewhere else entirely. King Charles lowered his eyes in that very moment, and that single movement carried its own heavy confession. The king understood the wound perfectly because he had spent a whole lifetime learning that royal power could lift a man up before the world, then remind him without mercy that he was still answerable to the crown. The High Court, the senior court that decides major legal disputes involving public authority, ruled that William had zero personal authority to alter, surrender, restrict, reinterpret, or independently control the formal powers attached to his own princely title. This mattered immensely because a title inside the monarchy is never just a simple name on a page. It is a massive structure of duty, status, and permission. The crown's constitutional structure, the complex legal framework that decides how royal authority is held and passed through the institution, was declared significantly stronger than William's personal will. He could carry the title, he could represent it at events, but he could not command it as private property. Queen Camilla noticed a shift instantly. She watched the room change around him, watched courtiers lower their voices in whispers, and watched legal advisors actively avoid his eyes. The queen consort understood what others were still too shaken to admit, that the ruling had weakened William at the exact moment he needed to look untouchable to the public. Catherine turned slightly toward him as if her presence alone could shield him from the sting of the court. But even she could not undo the line that had cut deepest into his heart, which stated that his personal wishes carried no independent legal force unless approved through crown authority and formal court recognition. Charles said absolutely nothing when the papers were gathered by the clerks. The king only set his fingers against the table, then withdrew them as if even touching the judgment made him part of his son's public disgrace. William rose slowly from his seat. He did not speak to Camilla. He did not look back at the judges. And he walked out with Catherine right beside him, the sound of every step echoing to the future of the monarchy. As William walked out under the weight of that verdict, the palace began asking the question no one dared speak aloud: who had wanted him exposed this badly? Behind the court's polished language stood a family deeply divided by fear, pride, and inheritance. William was not fighting only for wording on a page. Catherine was not watching only a legal setback, and Charles was not hearing only a judgment. Each of them understood that a title is never just a title inside a monarchy. It is power, identity, duty, and sometimes a cage. William returned to the private palace room without the certainty he had carried into court earlier that day. He did not slam the door. He did not raise his voice. And that was exactly what made the moment more painful. He stood there for several seconds, breathing through a silence that felt heavier than any public defeat, then reached for his cufflinks and removed them slowly. The small pieces of metal, once only part of royal dress, suddenly felt like reminders of a life built on symbols he no longer fully controlled. His title was supposed to represent service, strength, and command, but now it carried a different meaning. It showed the world that even the future king could be corrected, contained, and legally restrained. Catherine stood beside him, but she did not rush to fill the quiet room with empty words. She understood the damage went far beyond pride. A blow to William's title was also a blow to the future standing of their children, because every royal position casts a shadow over the next generation. George, Charlotte, and Louis would one day inherit not only names and duties, but the consequences of how those names were defended. Now Catherine watched her husband stare at the floor, and only after the silence had sharpened did she finally say his name softly. William looked up, and in that instant, she forced him back from humiliation into reality. He was hurt, but he was not alone. He had been weakened in public, yet his family still needed him steady. Charles understood that truth too, but the king carried another heavy burden. Behind closed doors, he admitted to a trusted aide that the legal office had known the risk. The words landed like a second betrayal. If the palace had known the risk, then William had walked into the chamber without being fully warned by his own father. Charles had allowed the machinery of monarchy to move forward, hoping it would protect the institution, even if it wounded his son. The monarch did not say it proudly. He said it like a man who had chosen duty and discovered the cost too late. Camilla received her own short briefing soon after. She listened carefully, asked for no emotional detail, and focused on the one question that mattered most to her. Did the judgment affect William's ability to block future royal arrangements? That question exposed the real battlefield. The ruling may have begun with law, but it was always moving toward family power. To understand why this judgment landed like a blade, the story must return to the one private incident that set everything in motion. Every scandal has a moment people later pretend was harmless, a conversation, a signature, or a glance across a room. For William, that moment came during a private Windsor investiture rehearsal, when a single ceremonial instruction turned into a constitutional challenge. What began as a dispute over word became the trigger that dragged his authority into court and exposed the fragile truth beneath the crown. William had arrived at the rehearsal believing he was there to prepare for duty, not defend his identity. The ceremony seemed ordinary at first, another carefully arranged royal moment built on tradition, timing, and language. An investiture is a formal royal ceremony where honors are given in the name of the crown, and every word spoken inside it carries weight, because it shows who holds authority and who acts on behalf of the monarchy. That was why the revised script mattered so much. It did not merely change phrasing, it changed meaning. William read the line once, then again, and the room seemed to tighten around him. The script no longer allowed him to speak by personal authority under his princely title. Instead, it said he would act by delegated authority of the crown, meaning his role came from permission granted by the monarchy rather than power held by himself. To anyone outside royal life, the difference might have seemed small, but to the prince, it was enormous. It made him sound temporary, borrowed, and managed like a servant of the institution rather than the future man chosen to lead it. William placed the script flat on the table and told the senior courtier he would not read words that reduce him in his own house. The courtier tried to soften the moment, explaining that the wording protected constitutional order, but the prince heard only one thing. Someone inside the palace had decided his authority needed a limit printed in black and white. His voice stayed controlled, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. He had spent his life being trained for power, and now power was being explained to him like a privilege he had misunderstood. Charles entered afterward with the tired caution of a man who already knew the danger. The king urged restraint. He told William that wording could be adjusted, that duty required patience, and that the crown must never look divided, but the prince heard betrayal hiding behind calm advice. He asked why his own father was more worried about the system than the son standing in front of him. Charles did not answer quickly, and that pause wounded more deeply than any argument. A sealed legal memorandum was prepared soon after, asking whether William's title gave him any independent authority beyond crown delegation. A memorandum is a formal written question or explanation used to guide legal action, and this one carried explosive force. It reached court after a palace faction insisted the issue had to be settled before future succession planning could move forward. From that rehearsal onward, the issue was no longer etiquette. It became a direct challenge to William's royal identity. When father and son finally faced each other after the ruling, the silence between them carried every word that had been avoided for years. The confrontation did not begin with shouting, and that made it worse. William entered Charles's private room with the stillness of a man trying not to break. While the king waited behind a desk, covered in papers, he suddenly seemed too tired to touch. No aides remained, no courtier softened the air. There was only a father, a son, and the title that had wounded them both. William stood before him carrying more than anger. He carried the shame of the court, the sting of the judgment, and the sickening knowledge that the palace machinery had moved without placing the full truth in his hands. The legal office, the palace team responsible for reviewing royal disputes, powers, and constitutional risks, had allowed the question of his authority to move forward. That mattered because William had not been challenging a stranger. He had been trapped by the very institution he was born to serve. He demanded to know why no one had warned him directly that the court could strip his title of personal force in such a public way. Charles did not answer like a father first. He answered like a monarch. He told William that the crown had to protect the institution before protecting any one person, even the heir. The words were careful, but they cut deep. To the king, the monarchy had survived for generations because no single royal could be allowed to stand above the structure itself. To William, that explanation sounded like abandonment dressed as duty. He pushed a copy of the judgment across the desk and said the court had not merely defined his title. It had diminished him. Charles removed his glasses slowly, and for a moment, the king looked older than his crown, worn down by the same system he was defending. He told William that duty had always been heavier than dignity. He said every monarch learns that truth eventually, and every heir resented before understanding it. But the prince did not soften. He had spent his life preparing to carry the future, and now his own father was asking him to accept humiliation as a lesson. The pain between them was not loud. It was colder than that. It was the kind of pain that grows when two men love the same institution, but bleed from it in different ways. Charles finally admitted what William feared most. He had signed off on the legal review. He had not expected the ruling to become this severe, this exposed, or this personally brutal, but he had allowed the question to be asked. That was the revelation that changed the room completely. William realized his humiliation had not been accidental. It had been accepted as a necessary cost by those closest to the throne. William said nothing for several seconds. Then he gathered the judgment, turned away, and left without giving the king the comfort of forgiveness. Charles remained behind, staring at the empty space where his son had stood, knowing that monarchy had won the legal argument but deeply damaged the family. When William left the room, the heavy wooden door closed softly, but inside the ancient walls of the palace, that small sound felt like a catastrophic fracture. Once that door closed, everyone's attention immediately shifted to the invisible hands operating behind the court's judgment, the powerful people who truly controlled the power William thought was his own. The monarchy survives for generations because real power rarely shows its face directly to the public. It moves silently through royal seals, councils, private letters, formal permissions, and legal phrases so old they sound entirely harmless until they are suddenly used as deadly weapons. William had believed for his whole life that his title automatically gave him absolute command, but the court's ruling proved something much colder. The crown can give a man grandeur, titles, and public applause while keeping the actual keys to power hidden somewhere else entirely. William did not ask for any sympathy when the next private meeting was hastily arranged by the palace staff. He wanted absolute clarity. He wanted to know exactly what had been legally taken from him, and worse, what had never truly belonged to him at all. The ruling had clarified that his princely title operated strictly inside a controlled constitutional framework, meaning a complex legal system where royal powers are continuously shaped by crown authority, court interpretation, and formal palace procedure. That mattered immensely because it turned his title from a personal shield into an institutional instrument. The prince could stand before the entire nation with centuries of glorious history right behind him, but history did not mean personal control. It only meant permission, and permission could be measured, delayed, or withheld by the system. The keeper of royal instruments arrived at the private office with the visible discomfort of a man carrying a bad truth wrapped in careful, diplomatic language. The name of the office sounded ancient, almost purely ceremonial, but its practical role inside the palace was brutally functional. The keeper confirmed precisely which royal powers were active, symbolic, or delegated. William listened in complete silence as the official explained that many powers attached to his title were ceremonial unless explicitly activated by the sovereign. Ceremonial powers meant duties that looked incredibly powerful in public, but did not carry any independent legal command. Delegated powers meant authority loaned by the crown, not owned by the person using it. The distinction was small on paper, but inside that quiet room, it was devastating. William did not interrupt the official once, and that intense restraint made the moment feel far more dangerous. His jaw tightened only once, when the keeper admitted that even the words he used in public ceremonies had to be approved through language held elsewhere. The prince had been trained since childhood to speak with supreme confidence, to carry authority without a single hesitation, and to make the monarchy feel completely steady during national storms. Now, he was being told that the very voice of his title depended on phrases approved by others. Success had given him applause, but suffering had finally given him the truth. Then came the register. A private register kept far away from public view showed that certain powers William had assumed were automatic had never been formally released to him. A register is an official record used to track royal permissions, titles, and powers, and this one carried the kind of silence that ruins all certainty. William saw the entries clearly. He understood the empty blanks on the page, and humiliation deepened because the ruling had not created the weakness. It had simply exposed it. Camilla's household received notice of the same register soon after, and that changed everything. The queen consort did not need a grand speech to understand its political value. Others now knew exactly where William was vulnerable. The machinery had spoken, and now the consequences began moving to the family like a cold current. As the palace slowly adjusted to this new reality, William faced the first painful sign that everyone around him had already begun treating him differently. Humiliation rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in small, subtle changes. A delayed briefing, a different chair, a document sent to someone else first. For William, the first consequence came the next morning when a sealed royal schedule reached Charles before it reached him. It was a tiny procedural shift, but inside the palace, it landed like a public demotion. William understood the meaning before anyone explained it. The schedule was not dramatic. It did not carry angry language or open punishment, and that made it more brutal. Palace offices had begun routing certain title-related decisions through Charles's office instead of William's private team. That shift mattered because control inside a monarchy often lives in paperwork before it ever appears in public. A royal schedule is a formal plan for duties, ceremonies, and appearances, and when that schedule is redirected, it shows who is being trusted to approve the future. The prince had not lost his name, but he had lost first sight of decisions made under that name. Charles received the schedule with the heavy silence of a father who knew his son would feel the insult. The king could call a procedure. He could call it compliance with the court, but he could not pretend it was harmless. Compliance meant obeying the ruling, and the ruling had made one thing painfully clear. William's title could not move independently when crown authorization was required. Crown authorization meant formal permission from a monarch's office, and now every title-linked decision carried that invisible chain. The future king was still central to monarchy, yet suddenly he was no longer first in line to his own authority. William found the proof on a formal engagement paper. His name sat beneath Charles's approval line. He stared at it in disbelief, not because he failed to understand the process, but because he understood it too well. That one line turned the court's words into daily reality. It said he could tend, represent, speak, and serve, but only after another hand had cleared the path. The humiliation was quiet. No crowd saw it. No headline captured the exact pain, but inside him, something burned. Catherine found him alone at the desk, the unsigned paper resting before him like a challenge. She saw the anger rising, saw the way his restraint was beginning to crack, and gently moved the document away before it could become the focus of everything he wanted to say. William looked at her, wounded and furious. But Catherine did not flinch. She knew his suffering could either harden into bitterness or sharpen into strength. Their children needed the second, the monarchy needed the second, and deep down, so did he. A senior aide confirmed the new reality before the day ended, stating that William could not independently refuse a title-linked ceremonial duty without crown authorization. The words moved fast through the palace. Camilla's circle interpreted the shift as an opening, whispering that his strongest weapon had become a leash. But just when the palace expected William to retreat, Catherine forced him toward a different kind of strength. In the quiet that followed the first humiliation, William and Catherine faced each other without lawyers, titles, or shields. The turning point did not come from the court. It did not come from Charles. It came in a private room after the papers were cleared and the doors were locked. Catherine asked William the question no advisor dared ask. Was he angry because the court had taken power from him, or because it had revealed what kind of king he must become. William did not answer at once. The day had left him raw, not because he failed to understand the law, but because he understood exactly what it had done to him. Legal briefings had turned into palace whispers. Palace whispers had turned into quiet changes, and quiet changes had turned into a new reality where his title still sounded powerful, yet no longer felt entirely his. Catherine waited beside him with the patience of someone who knew pain could not be rushed into wisdom. No aide stood nearby to soften the truth. No official papers protected him from a question. Only his wife remained, and she had never looked at him as a title first. Catherine reminded him that the monarchy had always tested its heirs before trusting them with its full weight. An heir is a person expected to inherit the throne, and that role matters because it demands preparation long before power finally arrives. She told William that every future monarch reaches a moment when illusion is stripped away. Some lose privacy. Some lose freedom. Some lose the comfort of believing loyalty will always protect them. For him, the court had stripped away the illusion that his title alone could make him untouchable. That truth hurt, but it also showed him something deeper. The crown does not belong to the person who wants control most. It belongs to the one who can survive control being taken away. William finally admitted what had been sitting beneath his anger, that the ruling had made him feel like a symbol carried by the crown, not a man trusted by it. He had spent his life preparing to serve, yet suddenly service felt like submission. He had been praised as strong, steady, and ready. But in one judgment, all that public confidence had been placed beneath legal permission. Catherine took his hand and did not offer false comfort. She told him that authority people fear can be removed, but authority people believe in must be earned. Those words changed the room completely. William understood then that a public challenge would only deepen the wound. If he fought the ruling in anger, he would look smaller than the judgment itself. If he resisted the crown to defend his pride, he would prove the court right about the danger of personal power. So he chose discipline. He prepared a controlled statement accepting the legal limits, not because the pain had vanished, but because restraint could reclaim what humiliation had tried to steal. William gave them something none of them had fully prepared for: composure. When the world saw William choose composure over retaliation, the humiliation began transforming into something the palace had not predicted. By the arrival the next morning, the explosive story had completely escaped the high security of the palace walls. It was no longer a private family wound or a hidden legal technicality, kept in sealed vaults. It now belonged entirely to the waiting public. Every major headline wanted blood. Every media commentator across the country wanted to see an open, permanent fracture inside the House of Windsor. But one powerful, striking image printed across a London front page instantly changed the entire national mood. It was an original photo of William standing right beside Catherine, looking visibly pale but completely steady, flatly refusing to look defeated before the cameras. William saw the front page long before the palace offices finished measuring the extent of the damage. The London Herald had placed the story exactly where no single citizen could possibly miss it, under the brutal and unforgiving headline that read, "A title without command." The words were sharp enough to wound him twice. First, they loudly repeated the public humiliation he had faced in the chamber. Then, they turned his personal struggle into a critical national question. Was the future king deeply weakened by the court's ruling, or had the monarchy successfully proved that even its most important, high-ranking heir must bow completely to constitutional discipline? Constitutional discipline means rigid rules that keep royal power strictly controlled by law and institution, rather than personal desires or ego. That mattered immensely, because the public was no longer just watching a simple family disagreement play out in private. They were watching the very future of the British monarchy being tested in open, harsh daylight. Catherine sat quietly with him as the media coverage grew louder and more aggressive by the hour. Major broadcasters framed the ruling as the most intensely personal royal authority crisis of his entire adult life. This was not because his ancient title had vanished, but because its strict legal limits had been exposed before the eyes of the whole country. One prominent commentator openly called it a royal stripping of power, and Catherine immediately reached for the remote control before that specific phrase could settle too deeply in the quiet room. She switched off the television broadcast, not in defense of denial of reality, but in fierce protection of her husband's mind. William did not protest her action at all. He had heard more than enough. He knew that malicious words would always travel much faster than any logical explanation. He also knew that showing raw anger would only feed the media storm. William finally spoke with a calm restraint that startled even those closest to his private team. He said the country must never see him fighting the crown for his own sake. That single sentence changed the entire meaning of the day. The crown, meaning the monarchy as a legal and highly symbolic institution, had wounded him deeply. But if he attacked it publicly to defend his pride, he would look like a man fighting for himself instead of serving his ultimate duty. Catherine understood the massive sacrifice hiding inside that difficult choice. It was far easier to rage against the judges. It was far easier to deny the court's power. It was far harder to stand completely still while the world decided what kind of man he was truly becoming. Outside Kensington Palace, the public mood shifted in a way no palace office or advisor had predicted. A large crowd gathered near the gates, but not with jeers, mockery, or protest signs. People waited quietly, watching intently for any response from the couple, as if the heavy silence itself had suddenly become a profound measure of national respect. The public humiliation had not disappeared. It had simply transformed its shape. What began as a devastating legal defeat was rapidly becoming an ultimate test of personal dignity, and William's absolute composure was turning the media story away from institutional weakness and toward human endurance. Camilla's circle had fully expected the brutal headlines to damage his public standing beyond repair. Charles had expected cold distance from his son. Catherine had hoped for a basic steadiness. But even she could feel the public mood bending back in their favor. The public had delivered its own profound judgment, and now William had to decide whether this ruling would define him as a prince permanently reduced by law or a future king significantly strengthened by personal restraint. By the time the heavy palace doors opened again to the world, the verdict was no longer only legal. It had become deeply personal, public, and final. In the very end, the High Court did humiliate Prince William, and there is no soft or comfortable way to dress that truth up. It exposed the absolute limits existing beneath his princely title and forced him to stand before the entire country as a future king who did not fully control the name he carried from birth. But the final, true meaning of that historic moment was not defeat. It was a grand revelation. The crown had wounded him, and he had survived the blow without breaking down. William understood the internal damage now with painful, sharp clarity. The court's ruling had permanently separated personal pride from constitutional duty. That separation mattered because it showed the public the real truth behind modern royal power. A princely title may sound like absolute ownership to outsiders, but inside the machinery of the monarchy, it is a heavy duty shaped entirely by law, continuous approval, and selfless service. Constitutional duty means the absolute legal responsibility to serve the crown's structure long before serving personal feelings. For the prince, that truth had arrived like a sudden physical blow, yet also forced him to face the ultimate question every future king must answer. Would he defend his personal pride, or would he protect the continuity of the institution, even when it hurt him to his core? King Charles accepted the court's decision as final, but his acceptance did not make the situation painless. The king privately told William, in a recorded family account specifically prepared for the secret palace archives, that he now understood the profound loneliness of the throne more deeply than he ever had before the judgment was delivered. He admitted that royal power often looks grand and desirable from a long distance, but close up, it can feel like complete isolation from the world. That mattered because Charles was not only speaking as a ruling monarch, he was speaking as a father who had watched his own son suffer under the exact same crown they both served. The monarch had defended the institution, but he could no longer deny the severe human cost of that defense. William answered his father entirely without bitterness, and that choice changed everything between them. He admitted the ruling had hurt his pride deeply, but he also said it had taught him where real, unshakable authority must come from. It did not come from legal phrasing on parchment. It did not come from grand ceremonies, and it did not come from the fear of being challenged by others. Real authority had to come from inner discipline, personal restraint, and the deep trust that regular people give when they see a leader carry immense pain without ever turning it into a quest for revenge. Catherine heard those profound words, and understood that something inside her husband had finally settled. The man who had been deeply wounded by the court had become noticeably steadier because of it. Camilla's hopes of using this public humiliation as a weapon against his future standing began to fade away completely. The queen consort had expected visible weakness, perhaps even a public outburst of anger. But William's absolute restraint made any open defiance look incredibly small and petty. Catherine remained a quiet, faithful witness to his complete transformation, seeing what everyone else had missed. The court had legally limited his title, but it had permanently strengthened his inner character. The monarchy's final verdict became crystal clear to the world. William lost technical control over the formal power of his princely title, but he gained something far greater: the emotional authority of a future king who learned that true dignity is strongest when personal pride is forced to kneel. This was the exact day William discovered that while a title can be limited by the law, a future king is ultimately measured by how he rises after being thoroughly humbled.